Hello and welcome to U.S. Mortality Trends through the pandemic. This is part 6 of a series, and in this part, we're looking at heart disease and cancer solely. Before we really focus in on close up on the pandemic years, and we're really looking at how mortality rates, or I should say death rates for specific 5-year age groups changed in 2020 through 2022, and the 2022 numbers are provisional, so those can change and maybe by quite a bit. And I'll explain in a moment. Let's look at the broad trend going back to 1999, and I did more of this detail in part 5 of the series. Heart disease and cancer are the top 2 causes of death and have been for decades. I could push it back, over a century. But anyway, here's heart disease and cancer on an age-adjusted death rate basis. Heart disease is number 1, cancer is number 2. COVID came in at number 3, but you can see heart disease had been improving, coming down for a long time, and then kind of, plateaued around the 20-teens, and then came up during the pandemic. Then we see cancer actually pretty steadily improving through the decades, and then seem to have leveled off during the pandemic. So let's look. Heart disease and cancer are part of this group of causes of death that we'll call physiological causes, as opposed to the external causes of death, which are accidents, homicides, and suicides, which I'm going to break up accidents to sub-causes, but that will be in future videos. So let's start with the number 1 cause of death, and I need to reorient you for this graph here. The vertical scale is a logarithmic scale. So you see it goes 0, then 1, then 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. So this is kind of a funky looking scale for the vertical. And then you'll see my age groups along the bottom horizontally. The children groups are a little different, so it's less than 1 year. That's my infant mortality. Then 1 to 4, then we've got our 5-year age groups, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. And then my oldest age group is 85 plus years. In general, I'm not going to be looking at the child groups, but I'll throw them in to a certain extent. So here's the child groups down here. So they have a funky looking curve. Babies, infant mortality does tend to be higher, and you have to get to young adults to get about the same range. It's very low for actual children, so 1 to 14, it's very low. And then it's kind of this curve. It's not exactly a line, but we've got these curves that look like they're overlapping each other, more or less. I've made them very thick, so it's hard to see on this graph what changed between the years. And you'll notice I have 2018 through 2022, and again, 2022 is provisional. This is as of the most recent update on CDC Wonder, which was the first week of April 2023. And it has this little bend in these last few older ages. But you can see, okay, remember this is per 100,000, so this 1,000 line is basically 1% death rate just from heart disease. And this is any kind of heart disease. So you can orient yourself to how this graph looks. And remember, this is going to be your top cause of death for the United States. So this looks like it's overlapping, but I'm now going to show you the relative change against 2019. And I am going to have a graph like this for each major cause of death with 2020, 2021, and 2022. And now we can see what changed. And I do want to point out I started with age 25 because below that age, this one looks pretty funky. In the video notes, I will have a link to where you can download the spreadsheets where I did all of these, and I have the numbers for, younger than age 25. It's just that the statistics for children, young adults are, kind of funky because there's actually very few people who die that young of heart disease. Okay, So what we are seeing here, so take a look at what these relative changes look like. The dark blue is 2020. And look at what the top of this scale looks like. The max is at 25%, but my highest bar is for the youngest adults, for 25 to 29-year-olds, and it's just under 20%. So for 25 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 34, and that's in 2021. We're seeing our worst experience, and it kind of comes down, kind of like this slope. Isn't that interesting for 2021? It's a little different pattern for 2020, so that's our dark blue. And all of this is in relation to the rate seen in 2019. Okay, I'm all comparing it against 2019. So for 2020, the increase in heart disease death rate for the 25 to 29-year-olds is, I'm just eyeballing it here, about 12%, 11 to 12%. And then it's a little higher for 30 to 34. We see the highest increase for 35 to 39-year-olds, and then it comes down more or less. So it goes up and then down, or maybe, I'm sorry, I forget which way the camera goes for you. So up and then peak at 35 to 39 and then down. And the least increase relative for those over 85 years old in 2020. But remember, the death rate for heart disease is already highest for those who are over age 85. It's still increasing with increasing age. It's just how the curve is. It's an increasing curve. Okay, this is talking about relative to what it was in 2019 for that age group. Then for 2021, we see the peak here at age 25 to 29 and then coming down. Now, the most active for the pandemic was in 2021. In 2022, we had most of the COVID deaths at the beginning of the year, so like January, February, and then it came down from there. After spring 2022, there was not much activity. There was some excess deaths at the end of the year, but a lot of that was actually going back to flu and some other stuff. So let's look at let's look at what the graph is showing now for 2022. Now the relative heart disease deaths, yeah, it's somewhat elevated for the younger adults. It's almost nothing for the middle-aged adults, so 50 to 54, 55 to 59, it's down there. But now we have a little bit of a spike for 75 to 79. It's a little above 10%. And we are seeing it elevated for 80 to 84 and 85 plus. These, again, are rates, not counts. So this is how much the death rate due to heart disease went up for these. So these are different patterns. I'm not saying why this occurred. This is just what's in the death certificates using the rates now. The 2022 ones may change. Now, what may change? It's not the numerator so much. Those probably are pretty good for heart disease. This is number one cause. That number on the top for the death rates are probably not going to change very much. And also, they're pretty good at getting the age of the people who died. So that's not the issue. The issue is the denominator. And they're using census estimates for the population in those age ranges. Well, there wasn't one for 2022. They were using the 2021 estimates, and I didn't update those. I just took it out of the system directly. Okay, so when I do my day job, I will make my own estimates and stuff. Someone's paying me for that. I might trend things and do other things to make estimates for these rates. Now, it's not going to change a huge amount, but let's remember, the vertical scale here is 25%, but actually the top relative change that we saw was in 2021, and a little bit below 20%. So just, stick a pin in it and remember that, okay? These are all relative, and you have to think about how many deaths those are. 25 to 29-year-old people in 2019 dying of heart disease, it's not a huge number of people, just FYI. Even when you have millions of people, it's not a huge number. So from a relative standpoint, it really doesn't take a lot of extra people dying in those age ranges to really boost those rates. But at older ages, think about it, this is one of the top causes of death for them, and they are dying in thousands and millions up there. Okay, so it takes a lot of extra people to push that number up. So now we're looking at the curve for cancer. Notice for children, we don't have that really funky curve that we saw with heart disease. And of course, some of that is because you have infant mortality due to congenital heart problems for that one. But with cancer, it's pretty much increasing death rates with increasing age. And another thing I want you to notice is the steepness of the curve compared to heart disease. So heart disease was more like this. Cancer is more like this. And what's interesting is, especially with the levels, I'm not putting these on the same graph, but cancer is actually higher rates at these lower, younger adults. It's a top cause of death, especially in this range here in like 40s to 50s, that heart disease death rates are actually lower than the cancer death rates in this range. It's only in these very high age groups that the heart disease will exceed the cancer death rates because of the difference in the steepness of the curves. So that's kind of how those work when we look at the shape. And we'll see other curves when we're looking at physiological, but also external causes of death have very different shapes to their curves. So physiological causes of death in general have this, general slope where you have an increasing death rate with increasing age, and it can look kind of different for children. But here's the one that's really funky, and this is this percentage difference versus 2019. Look at this vertical scale. The death rates actually went down for these middle age groups, and remember, cancer is the top cause of death pre-pandemic for these ages, and it went down. Okay. Now remember that cancer for death rates were generally trending down to begin with anyway. This may actually be excess mortality because it didn't go down as much as it should have. Remember, it looked like it kind of stalled out a little bit in 2021 and 2022. However, it's probably because of this spike at the age 85 plus years. Remember, this is just relative to what their base rate is. And this spike here, that might have a lot more impact on the overall age-weighted death rate compared to what these changes are. It's hard to say, but also there's some weird stuff going down here. Still, when you look at the overall vertical scale, it's not a huge amount of difference. Most of it is between plus or minus 5%, and you will get a certain amount of fluctuation year to year. Especially some of these here in the 60s and 70s. These aren't really high magnitude differences. When we look at some of these causes of death in future videos for physiological and definitely for external causes of death, we're going to see some huge fluctuations. This is puny. It actually looks like cancer was not very heavily affected in terms of death rates during the pandemic. And I'm not that surprised because think about it, cancer is a slow way of dying compared to a lot of these other ways of dying. Heart disease can be a pretty rapid way of dying, especially ischemic heart disease. And then when we see stroke and some other physiological causes of death, some of them are rather rapid ways to die. and others are a little more drawn out in general. External causes of death tend to be very rapid ways to die. So those can have some very large changes year to year. And we will see that during the pandemic, a lot of them did have some very large changes. So to wrap this particular video up, I'm bringing it back to this slide where we don't have the age groups anymore, and we're not focused in just on 2020 through 2022, but we're going back to the historical 1999 to 2022. And we're looking again, we're collapsing each death rate trend to a single number for each year, which is this age-adjusted death rate. And we can kind of see the trajectory for each of them. And again, not saying exactly, what's the driver for each of these, what's going on here, but we can kind of see the magnitude difference. Now that we're stepping back, we've seen the effect in the different age groups for each of these. So cancer had a pretty steady, improvement each year up until we hit 2020. It actually continued that improvement till 2020 and then stalled. It went up a little bit in 2021 and 2022 and again, provisional for 2022. We'll see how it actually shakes out. But it doesn't look like cancer was affected, the way that we're seeing heart disease death rates were affected. But if we step back, and this is one of the issues with some of the analyses that we're seeing through the pandemic and death rates, is that everyone's focused, just on what happened 2020, 2021, 2022, without pulling back and seeing, oh, wait a second, maybe something was going on in the population before we even hit the pandemic. Because if we pull back and we look through those 20 teens, it looked like mortality improvement was already stalling out before we hit the 20 teens. And there's a variety of things that could be influencing that. But obviously, we're like, woo, it's a ski slope. Things were not doing so great with heart disease death rates before we hit the pandemic. So, that's something that we're looking at here. Things that we're looking at. So future videos we're going to look at in the next set of videos, we'll be looking at additional physiological, so that's non-external causes of death. And then we'll look at some external ones, but they'll have to be broken out. And I've been delaying these because I'm waiting for additional data updates. As I've mentioned before, this drop that we see in the provisional for 2022, while it's real for COVID, it's not real for external causes of death like accidents, homicides, and suicides due to censored data. So we'll be coming back to that. I'm waiting for unfortunately, June data updates to get a better feel for where that's going to land. So later.